Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to spend a few minutes with me as I talk about this presentation entitled Narratives of Discomfort on Being Indigenous in Diaspora, Re-Encountering the Colonial Through Critical Autoethnography. As many researchers have in the past 2 years, this research was a result of being in a pandemic. In the words of a friend, this year has been one of forced introspection. As such, this research is about turning inward, of research as introspection, as we are all in this period of momentous isolation. Employing methods informed by critical autoethnography and affective methodology, I bring forth the personal through storytelling and narrative writing of memories, observations, and reflections. I engage with these personal narratives in order to situate my lived experiences within larger systems of power. I adopt a critical autoethnographic position in this research. This approach, as Boylorn and Orb describe, aims to understand the lived experiences of real people in context, to examine social conditions and uncover oppressive power arrangements, and to fuse theory to narrative to challenge processes of domination. I adapt the stance of fusing theory and narrative as Holman Jones, who describes theories as living bodies of thought, stating that theory is a story. Theory tells a story in non-ordinary language of how things are and helps us discover the possibilities of how things might be. In line with affective methodologies in which affects are conceptualized as ethical and methodological tools, I turn to discomfort. Chadwick poses that discomfort can be a lively actant in research encounters and analytical spaces. So now I turn to discomfort as a starting point that allows me to locate events in my life that are affective hotspots for analysis and interpretation. Tracing moments of discomfort, personal and collective histories of the indigenous as other. I now share some insights that have resulted in this process. I begin by sharing some comments I have personally received from others upon learning that I am indigenous. Where's your tail? You don't look like an Igorot. Wow, you speak such good English for an Igorot. Growing up, hearing these statements caused personal discomfort. These are statements that illustrate the persistence of a colonial perspective deeply rooted in the history of the Igorot. The Igorot is a collective term to identify all the indigenous groups living in the Gran Cordillera Central, the highest and single largest mass of mountains in the Philippines. When the Spanish began its occupation of the Philippines in 1521, expeditions were sent to the mountains to secure gold deposits. The highland villages fought to defend their land and raised a successful resistance. With this failure, the Spanish waged a propaganda war through missionary and bureaucratic reports that equated the Igorot with savagery and barbarism. Although Igorots had existing trade relations and exchanges with lowland Filipinos prior to Spanish occupation, the Hispanized lowland Filipinos would come to imbibe the meaning of Igorot according to this negative imagery, creating a lowland-highland divide reinforced by colonial discourses. This is best captured in a statement from a statesman in 1943 who described the Igorot as primitive Black people who are no more Filipino than the American Indian is representative of the United States citizen. They hold exactly the same position. They are our aborigines. The fact remains that the Igorot is not Filipino. These discourses framing the Igorot as the other have endured, constituting a body of knowledge that has been used to justify the marginalization of Igorots in Philippine society from colonial times to present day. As the comments reflect, personal and collective experiences have demeaning consequences. Starting in the Spanish and American colonial periods, the term Igorot was used as derogatory to frame the Highlanders as savage in contrast to civilized and developed colonizers. While Igorots have resisted through warfare, political struggle, and reclaiming through cultural representation, these colonial legacies still reinforce the notions of Igorot as primitive in the Philippine imaginary. It is as though we remain fixed in time and place. And this discounts and silences the many experiences of Igorots who, through decades of settling and unsettling, now live urbanized diasporic lives. This othering is still employed to deny the validity of indigenous peoples. And this, in part, is owed to how research was done on indigenous peoples. And so now we move on to colonial legacies, the indigenous as object. When I first began implementing discomfort as my starting point, this is the one memory that first surfaces in my mind. I am sitting inside the classroom at the furthest row from the blackboard. The professor is a non-Igorot, but is talking about fieldwork amongst an Igorot community that had recently been receiving a rising number of local tourists. The professor, I notice, shares overtly generalized statements. When a fellow student raises her hand and asks a question about how the community feels with this demand of cultural tourism, which was a very apt question, I thought, this professor pauses, looks at the student, responds, "You should buy my book." A long, uncomfortable silence descends upon the room. The professor proceeds with the lecture, never answering the student's question. By the end of the class, the professor encourages us, yet again, to buy the book containing the information about this Igorot's community traditions, practices, and experiences. When Sarah Ahmed explains that discomfort is rooted in bodily and sensory experiences, I think of myself sitting in that classroom. When I heard, "Buy my book," a wave of physiological unease occurs in me. I shifted my seat. Up until the end of the lecture, and well after it ended, actually, I remained visibly upset. I think about this professor's position to be placed at the seat of authority about a certain indigenous group, simultaneously gatekeeping the knowledge learned from them. And in an academic setting, no less. It happened inside a classroom of anthropology students where there should have been discussions of learning and exchange. I was in discomfort and I was appalled. As I reflect on this memory, I think about the history of research and indigenous peoples. I recall the famous opening paragraph of Linda Tuhiwai Smith's book, Decolonizing Methodologies, that research is probably one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous world's vocabulary. When mentioned in many indigenous contexts, it stirs up silence, it conjures up bad memories, it raises a smile that is knowing and distrustful. By now, there has been much resistance to this long and convoluted history of research on the indigenous. There have been calls to challenge colonial pasts of certain disciplines, anthropology, for example. Still, the result of these types of research still affect marginalized communities today. Ethnological and anthropological studies on the Igorot and other indigenous peoples played into social classifications and colonial projects like human zoos. All of this remains to perpetuate the image of the primitive. This kind of research that flattens indigenous experiences into a single category, a single story, produces limited frames of reference, which is a term I borrow from Frantz Fanon. Colonialism had already brought with it complete disorder to colonized peoples, divorcing them from their histories, their languages, and their ways of knowing. Research on indigenous peoples deepens this rupture by writing and representing indigenous peoples as essentialized and homogenized, resulting in these obscured frames of reference by which indigenous peoples construct their identity. But these obscure frames of reference, one that paints indigenous peoples as coherent, unified, and fixed, was opposed to what I was, which was fragmented, entangled, living in diasporic states of movement. I had grown up learning about my people through these limited frames, and as such, I experienced ambivalence and anxiety, at times, even distrust, when foregrounding my indigenous identity. Of course, there has always been resistance to this kind of representation, and Igorots have pressed against their marginalization in various ways. These are all sites of struggle that are underpinned by othering, which in turn play into the construction of Igorot identity, whether by Igorots themselves or by others. In conclusion, indigenous peoples need diverse frames of reference, frames that reflect the many social and cultural realities that people have. There is a danger in similar kinds of knowledge produced in the same privileged spaces. There needs to be many other voices, diverse voices, that lend themselves to the larger goals of decolonizing, making various narratives of indigenous peoples known, creating more frames of reference for us to build on when reconstructing our individual and collective indigenous identities. Before I end, I would just like to share some reflections on the methods shared in this presentation. I aim to illustrate how narratives and autoethnographic accounts may be used to challenge what are pervasive binaries that exist in anthropology, but also in the broader field of social sciences. By using critical autoethnography that provokes questions about the nature of traditional ethnographic knowledge, this process aims to disrupt, essentializing representations of people and cultures, in this case, indigenous peoples in diaspora, drawing attention instead to human stories, emotions, and embodied experiences. A narrative approach further supports this push against false binaries, in which often separates and values theory over embodied knowledge. And this, in the words of Pathak, is a deeply colonialist position. Instead, to know is not merely abstract. To know is to engage with one's mind, body, and heart. And so, though this short presentation, I hope I have lended my voice to contribute to research that does not flatten representation of already marginalized peoples. Finally, staying with feelings that we might wish would go away potentially becomes a form of radical praxis. Thus, I invite you to consider engaging with affects in qualitative inquiry, discomfort being one of the most potent ones. I invite you to consider dismantling the objective distance that separates us researchers from the cultural worlds that we live in. Through this process, I have since learned that this very discomfort is worth exploring. Doing research need not be comfortable at all. Thank you very much. I wish you all a good day.